Ever find yourself thinking about those pivotal moments in history? Like, if just one thing had gone differently, how would the world have changed?
Oh, absolutely. Those what-if scenarios are always so intriguing.
Well, today we're diving deep into one of those what-ifs, taking a look at the Chernobyl disaster through the lens of something called the butterfly effect.
Fascinating concept, isn't it? The idea that even the smallest action can have huge, unintended consequences.
Exactly. And when you think about a disaster like Chernobyl, it's not just the event itself, but the whole chain of decisions, those little moments that led up to it. Our source material really digs into the context, starting with the setting Pripyat, Ukraine, back when it was part of the Soviet Union. What was the Soviet Union's deal with nuclear power back then? It seems like it was a pretty big deal for them.
Oh, you better believe it. For them, nuclear power wasn't just about energy. It was a huge source of national pride.
Really?
Absolutely. It was a symbol of their technological prowess, something they could wave in the face of the West during the Cold War.
Like a look what we can do kind of thing.
Exactly. They were obsessed with proving they could outdo the rest of the world in this new era of nuclear technology.
So there was this underlying pressure to be the best, even if it meant like cutting corners.
Unfortunately, yeah, that was definitely a factor. And that's where we see some of those early dominoes start to fall. See, to really flex their nuclear muscles, they chose to use a reactor design called the RBMK. Now, it was powerful, no doubt about that, but it had a pretty significant flaw.
Flaw? What kind of flaw?
It had what's known as a positive void coefficient.
Okay, gotta be honest, not really up on my nuclear jargon. Positive void coefficient. What exactly is that, and why is it a bad thing?
Okay, so imagine you're boiling water on the stove.
Okay, got it.
As the water heats up, it creates steam, those bubbles, right? Well, in an RBMK reactor, those bubbles are like these voids that form in the coolant as the reactor heats up. A positive void coefficient basically means that as those voids form, they actually make the reactor even hotter.
So it's like, instead of cooling down the reactor when it gets too hot, this flaw actually makes it even hotter.
Precisely. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Yikes. That's not good. So they built this reactor knowing it had this potentially dangerous flaw.
Yeah, and this is where the political climate gets really interesting. Remember that Soviet obsession with being the best in nuclear power?
Right.
Admitting there was a flaw in their design, that would have been a huge blow, a huge embarrassment.
Yeah, I can see that.
So they downplayed the risks, big time. They pushed forward, prioritizing speed and propaganda over, well, safety.
So we've got this reactor with a dangerous design flaw, and on top of that, there's this intense political pressure to just ignore the risks. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
And that brings us to April 25th, 1986. The day of the Chernobyl disaster.
And get this, they were actually scheduled to do a safety test on the reactor that day.
Ironic, isn't it?
Talk about a coincidence. What was the purpose of the safety test anyway?
Well, they were trying to simulate a power outage. They wanted to see if the reactor's turbines could still generate enough power to run the cooling system until the backup generators kicked in. Just a routine check to make sure the reactor could be safely shut down in an emergency.
Right, seems pretty standard. So where did things start going wrong?
Well, first off, the test was delayed by several hours.
Oh.
And that meant the reactor had to run at a much lower power level than usual, which, if you remember, made that whole positive void coefficient issue even worse.
Ah, right, because at lower power it was more unstable. Did they think about postponing the test at that point?
That's where things get really interesting. See, the deputy chief engineer, Anatoly Dyalov, he was under a lot of pressure to get this test done.
Pressure from who?
Well, there were rumors that he'd gotten in trouble for previous delays.
Ah, I see.
So he made the call to go ahead with the test, despite the less than ideal conditions.
That's a decision that'll keep you up at night. What if he had just, I don't know, trusted his gut, postponed it? It's crazy to think how different things might be.
Absolutely. And as if things weren't already risky enough, the test procedure also required them to disable certain safety systems.
Hold on, they turned off safety systems during a safety test? That makes no sense.
Yeah, no, it sounds counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But they had to do it to see how the reactor would respond on its own, in isolation. The big problem was the operators, they weren't fully aware of just how dangerous this reactor design was. They didn't really grasp the risks involved, especially with those safety systems turned off.
It's like they were playing with fire and had no idea how quickly it could burn out of control. So they're conducting this test, reactor's not in the best shape, safety systems are offline. This can't end well, can it?
Sadly not. things spiraled out of control pretty quickly. The power surged. It led to a catastrophic explosion.
Our source says the Chernobyl explosion was 400 times more powerful than Hiroshima. 400, I can't even wrap my head around that.
It's difficult to comprehend, isn't it? The sheer scale of the destruction, the immediate loss of life, and then, of course, the radiation.
Right, because this wasn't just contained to Pripyat. The source talks about the radiation spreading, having these long-term effects.
It was a global event. The radioactive plume traveled across Europe and beyond, contaminating everything in its path. We're talking land, air, water, you name it. And the health consequences, they were devastating. Increased cancer rates, birth defects, a whole range of radiation-related illnesses.
It's just heartbreaking. And our source also talks about the political fallout, how Chernobyl wasn't just a nuclear disaster, but a political one, too, for the Soviet Union.
Absolutely. Their initial instinct was to cover up the extent of the disaster.
Oh, wow.
But that just backfired spectacularly. Eroded public trust, exposed the flaws in their whole system.
So they were dealing with this incredibly dangerous technology and then compounded the problem by not being transparent about the risks, about what had happened.
Exactly. And when you look at it through the lens of the butterfly effect, it's like this: a flawed design, a culture of secrecy, and then those human errors, all these tiny decisions adding up to this massive event with global consequences.
It's almost impossible to grasp, really. If they had just changed one thing, made a different choice somewhere along the line.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About all the what-ifs in history, all those seemingly small decisions that shape the course of events.
It really does. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive, but before we go, I want to hear from you. If you could go back and change one decision in the lead up to Chernobyl, what would it be? Head over to our social media and let us know. And as always, thanks for listening.